The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most serious confrontation to take place between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The leaders of the two countries, President John F. Kennedy of the United States and Nikita Khrushchev, Premier of the Soviet Union, both played a crucial role in determining the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were very different leaders with very different social backgrounds. These social backgrounds helped to shape their political beliefs and philosophies, which influenced their actions. President Kennedy came from an extremely wealthy and highly political family. His grandfathers were two well-known political figures in the Boston area, and his father served as an ambassador. After graduating from Harvard in 1940 with a degree in science, President Kennedy became an intelligence officer in the Navy and was sent to the South Pacific to serve during World War II. After sustaining a back injury, Kennedy turned his aspirations towards politics. In 1946, Kennedy was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. During this time, he took a particular interest in foreign policy, which he maintained through his presidency. He was elected president in 1960, becoming the youngest person in history to ever be elected to the White House. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was born into the small, poverty-stricken village of Kalinova. His father was a manual laborer, and his family could not afford to send him to school because of the cost. It was this background that inspired him to become a member of the Communist Party. Khrushchev began his political career as a political organizer in the mines in which he worked as a metal worker. He gained favor with Stalin during World War II and was then appointed as the secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. By 1958, at the age of 68, he became the premier of the Communist Party. With respect to foreign policy, the ultimate goal of both leaders was to maintain the balance of power of the Cold War. Kennedy's foreign policy was based on the domino theory, which states that if one country falls to communism, those around it will likely fall as well, disrupting the balance of power. Khrushchev's foreign policy was known as peaceful coexistence, in which he wanted to avoid nuclear war with Western nations and also increase economic competition between communist and non-communist countries. In the spring of 1962, Khrushchev began to fear that the balance of power in the Cold War was shifting in favor of the U.S. He felt that the Soviet Union was in danger of losing the arms race. He devised a plan to place missiles in Cuba, believing that it would restore the balance of power in the Cold War. When the U.S. first became aware of the Soviet missile installations in Cuba, the first course of action was to impose a naval blockade to prevent Cuba from obtaining any more weapons. However, this was not all that successful, and President Kennedy was still left with the decision of whether or not war should be declared. On one hand, it was an election year. Republicans had constantly accused Kennedy of being soft on communism. This was his chance to prove his political opponents wrong. On the other hand, if he did declare war, this would be the world's first nuclear war. President Kennedy chose not to declare war on Cuba and the Soviet Union, allowing for compromise. This allowed the world to avoid its first nuclear war. Khrushchev also wanted to avoid an all-out war, and when it became apparent that Kennedy would send troops into Cuba if necessary, he agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if the U.S. agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy and to respect Cuba's sovereignty. The U.S. agreed to these demands, and a nuclear war was avoided. Both leaders played a critical role during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Although they had different means to achieving their goals, the ultimate goal for both leaders was to maintain the balance of power during the Cold War and to avoid a nuclear war. Through compromise, these goals were successfully attained, and the world's first nuclear war was avoided.